I heard someone say a long time ago that a stewardship season without the story of the widow's mite would be like Thanksgiving without the turkey. And considering we're going into Thanksgiving week, I don't want to deprive you of the turkey. So listen now to this word from Mark's gospel. It comes to us in the 12th chapter, verses 38 through 44. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearances, say long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then Jesus called the disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in," oh my goodness. Wow, thanks be to God. "She, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had and all she had to live on." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It is a great day. The book of Leviticus gets a really bad rap. And if you've ever committed to reading the Bible from start to finish, maybe when you're feeling really motivated at the beginning of a new year, then you probably know that the book of Leviticus is when you start questioning that decision. Genesis, well, that's great. Lots of interesting stories in there. Exodus reads like a Hollywood drama, but then comes Leviticus, and it's just cumbersome and really boring. One law after another that doesn't seem to be relevant to this world at all. So if you've made this commitment, then you know how tempting it is to get to Leviticus and then start saying, well, maybe I'll skim my way. That would still count as reading the whole Bible, right? Just want to get back to the good stuff. But I actually love the book of Leviticus, even though it is cumbersome. Want to guess how many laws are in those 27 chapters? 613. Seems a little bit excessive, doesn't it? The 10 Commandments are hard enough on their own. Is it even possible to keep track of 613 laws? Now, there are ways to split them up to try to make them more manageable. You can divide the lists into 2, things that it says to do and things that it says do not do. If you do that, you get 365 don't do this, thou shalt not. And then you get 248, do this, you shall do this. But even dividing up the 613 into those 2 lists doesn't really make them seem more manageable. But I don't think that this list was meant to be remembered word for word. I think there's something so much more beautiful happening with this list. 365 don't do's. That's 1 for every day of the year. Which might make you ask, so what's the significance of the 248 please do's? You shall do this. Well, that's 1 for every bone and organ in the body. That's not a mistake. You see, this list of laws comes to the Israelites right after they've been released from slavery. Their entire lives had been defined by what they could produce. Their value, or they believed their value, was based solely on how many bricks they could make each day and how quickly they could harvest the hay to make the bricks. This was a community of people whose identity could not be separated from their output, how much they could produce in a day. And so then they're freed from slavery, and they want to show gratitude to God. And so they decide that the best thing they can do is build a tabernacle. Build a place for God to dwell among them. A tabernacle is like a tent. And it was believed that you needed a tabernacle for God to come and spend the night among you. They were so grateful to God that they built God a home. They were trying to say, yes, we want to be in relationship with you, God, as a way to say thank you for freeing us from slavery. You know what happens? They build that tent, and then they just kind of wander aimlessly around outside the edges because they don't know what to do. They were building the tent because they knew how to produce, right? And they were trying to make that activity a way to glorify God. But then they said, well, we still don't really know how to be in relationship with God. We built this tent, but turns out going to the tabernacle for an hour on Sunday morning doesn't equal a life of faith. They didn't really know how to live in the world. That's why Leviticus is so important. That's why that number, 613, is so incredible. It's not a list of doctrine saying you will believe this, you will recite this creed. It's an invitation. It's a list of instructions for living a holy life. God is trying to help them orient their lives in a new way. A way that doesn't reduce the value of human life to what it can produce. A life that doesn't reduce faith to 1 hour of worship a week. 365 don't do's. That's one for every day of the year. 248 you will, you shall do. One for every bone and organ in the body, because being in relationship, being in a real relationship with God, well, it reorients our entire being. It is something that we embody, and it makes us reimagine how we might spend our days. So this list was not meant to be some cumbersome substitute for the bricks that they were used to, just another way to measure up whether they were getting it right, how valuable they were. This was a radical invitation to a new way of life. In all of these laws, there is a possibility for the Israelites to remember that they'd been claimed by God. And because they'd been claimed by God, God could not be confined to a tabernacle. In this list, the message is, there is nowhere you can do, there is nowhere you can go where you are separate from God. And because you cannot be separate from God, even the most ordinary part of your life can become holy. Even the most ordinary task of your daily life can point to something bigger than you. It could point back to God's grace. And that's what this harvesting law is all about. When you reap the harvest, don't reap to the very edges of the field or gather the gleaning, because those are for the poor and the alien. This is one of my most favorite images in all of Scripture. I come back to it over and over again. And I've shared this before, but in response to this law, the Israelites started harvesting square fields in circles. It was very inefficient. But I love that because those field crews could never look out at their work without remembering that they were simply stewards. The four corners of those fields were a reminder that it all belongs to God. And something as ordinary as a field can become an extraordinary reminder of God's grace. The four corners untouched. Just imagine the miraculous moments that happened in the four corners of that field. Maybe a refugee who'd escaped violence and made it to a better land, but has no idea how to find work, no idea how he'll learn the language, no idea how he'll find steady housing so his children can be enrolled in the school here and begin to feel settled. Someone who has nothing more than a heaping handful of questions and a heaping handful of fear walks by a field and sees that there is grain to be had and there is fruit to be had. It's as if someone knew he needed to feed his family. And so he loads up a sack to take home, and somehow the fear seems a little bit smaller. Or the hourly earner who had been busting it at work, trying to have just enough to cover the bills, nothing extra. Everything that came in had to go right back out for one reason or another, and he didn't really like living hand to mouth, but he'd always taken pride in the fact that he could care for himself. But one day his boss gathered up the crew and announced that the business was moving. They were opening new factories where there was cheaper labor, cheaper supplies, so this job was coming to an end. And they'd need to turn their keys back over and say their final goodbyes. And so this man and his colleagues walked through town toward an unknown future. And then one of them says, "You know what? Years ago, I passed a field and I saw that the corners weren't harvested, and I asked one of the workers about it. And he said, 'Oh yeah, that's what we always do. We always leave the edges of the field for those who need it.' And you know what? I think the corners of that field are for us today. Grace in something as small as the untouched corner of a field. Or a woman who'd had a really good life. She married and loved her husband. She raised her kids, got them off to college, and they didn't move home afterwards. They got jobs with insurance. But then her husband died suddenly, and everything she knew of the world evaporated with her death. She'd never worked outside the home. The first month was okay. Friends showed up with casseroles, more casseroles. But then the casseroles stopped coming, and she wondered if anyone would remember her. She didn't know how she'd make it through. She couldn't work, had no savings. But she came across a field, and she was amazed to see that in the very pattern of the field, someone remembered God's grace right there. I don't know if that widow had a conversation with any of the workers in the field, but she got it. This is what it means, she thought, to believe that God can work through even the most ordinary parts of our lives. I have to believe that that field had something to do with her offering at the treasury that day. She'd embodied the invitation to holy living because she knew what it was like to be the recipient of somebody else's holy living. So she gathered what she had, just 2 coins, not much by any standard, and she made her way to the treasury. That was one of the courts in the temples. Now, the temples were designed really intentionally because they wanted you to know your place in society. So the treasury was called the Court of Women. It was as far as women could go in the temple. They wanted to keep women from the Holy of Holies, but they certainly didn't want to keep them from making their offerings. I have just a few thoughts about that. The very floor plan was a reminder that she wasn't holy. She could come, she could make her offering, but then she'd need to go right back out. But she walked in with her spine reinforced by steel and confidence up, and she put in those coins not because she was trying to help the temple reach a budget goal, not because the temple needed a new sound system, not because she necessarily agreed with all that was happening, not because it was something she had to do or a box she had to check to be called faithful. I think she walked up and dropped her 2 coins into the treasury for the same reason that farmer left the 4 corners of the field untouched. Because she had said yes to the invitation to holy living. And you know what must have happened in that moment? She walked up knowing that she was never allowed to go to the Holy of Holies, but she realized she didn't need to make it to some back room to experience holiness. Because when you accept the invitation to holy living, God is capable of making your very life the holiest of holies. So today is our Commitment Sunday, and you're going to be invited when it comes time for the offering to walk forward your commitment, or a note that said you've made a commitment, as a reminder that this is something we embody. It's not a passive thing, it's an active thing. But I want to lift up one more detail of the widow's story, because the gospel goes to great lengths to share just how corrupt the temple was at the time the widow makes her offering. Jesus talks about it too. If there was ever a time for someone to sit it out and wait to see if the temple was going to go in a direction they liked, if ever there was a time for the widow to say, I don't like how they've allocated the budget, so when more funds go to the things that I'm passionate about, then I'll consider making a commitment. If ever there was a time for a faithful person to make those statements, it was her time. It was that day when she made that offering. But the harvest of the field points to something so much bigger. And so does the widow's offering. She was not making a commitment to the temple. She was making a commitment to God. She was saying yes to God's invitation to imagine a life where even 2 simple coins can reveal the grace of God. So I am going to say what I'm sure is the most highly unadvisable thing to say on a day like today. Ken, plug your ears. I think this is important. If making a commitment today feels like something you have to do, if it feels like something you just need to check off your list, or if it feels like you're just doing this because you're helping us reach some budget goal, then I would like to give you permission to sit it out. Your commitments are certainly connected to the health of this church, but they are not about this church. Your commitment is you saying yes to God's invitation to embody holiness, trusting that if it all belongs to God, then God is surely capable of transforming the 4 corners of our fields into nothing short of grace for this world. That's the commitment you're being asked to make. After all, in God we trust. Not in church we trust. Not in our own capabilities we trust. Not in our money we trust. In God we trust. I don't think we're that different than the Israelites. Don't we show up in the sanctuary week after week because we too want to answer the question, how shall we live? I learned a long time ago not to ask questions unless you're prepared to hear the answer. But that is a question that I do keep asking because the answer is just so good. How shall we live? Well, church, we should live like we believe it all belongs to God. How shall we live? We shall live like we believe an inefficient harvest can become grace for a weary world. How shall we live? We shall live like we imagine that our very lives can become grace for a weary world. It's all that easy, and it is all that hard. Amen.